Александрович и ваша семья приговорены к смерти и сейчас будете расстреляны.
Что? Что вы сказали? Повторите. Господи, прости их, не ведают, что творят.
The Russian Revolution and Civil War reshaped the global political landscape and inspired communist and anti-colonial movements worldwide throughout the 20th century. But how different would the world be if Russia had competent leadership during World War I? Thanks to the sponsor of today's video, Supremacy 1914, you have a chance to explore that question and change the course of history. This free online PvP strategy game lets you battle up to 500 players in weeks-long real-time campaigns. Control your economy, build and expand your armies with units such as tanks, planes, and infantry, declare war on your neighbors, forge alliances with other players, and devise a long-term strategy to dominate the world. I'm especially excited for the new Heroes update, which lets players unlock and level up unique World War I themed characters like Lucien LaRoche, a chemical warfare expert who gives bonuses to artillery attacks. Each hero provides powerful, passive bonuses to economy, military, or espionage gameplay, giving players more strategic depth and long-term goals. Collect, upgrade, and assign heroes to boost your nation's strength across multiple games. Supremacy 1914 is free to play and available on both PC and mobile, so you can play on the same account across devices. Support our channel and click the link in the description below, or scan the QR code to receive 31 days of premium account for new players, plus 50 shards to unlock the Lucien LaRoche hero at level 1 status, a package worth $15 available only for the next 30 days. Midnight strikes in Petrograd's Winter Palace. Once, the palace was the imperial showpiece of Romanov splendor, but those days seem gone. Now, a beleaguered Republican government waits out its final moments in its lavish breakfast room, as the guns of the warship Aurora thunder from the river Neva. A Bolshevik mob swarms its way through the palace, brawling with the fearsome defenders of the Battalion of Death. Just 5 hours after the assault began, a small unit of Red Guards bursts into the room and places the ministers under arrest. The Bolshevik takeover of Petrograd is complete. By the dawn of the 20th century, the Russian Empire offered fertile soil for revolution. Peasants groaned under feudal tyranny, while industrial workers suffered atrocious working conditions. Liberal politicians clamored for elected representation and an end to Tsar Nicholas II's absolute monarchism. The Russian tinderbox was ready to explode in 1905. Although that year's revolution resulted in the creation of a national elected parliament, the Duma, there was little substantial change. The Tsar undermined the power of the Duma, and the deep-rooted problems of Russian society remained present. In fact, many socialists and workers grew convinced that a second revolution was necessary. 12 years later, the Russian Empire was cracking at the seams. 2.5 years of all-out war with Germany took its toll on the vast empire. Russian losses were counted in the millions, while millions more were displaced. The war sucked enormous amounts of peasants into the army and the urban labor force. Mainly due to inefficient logistics, food and fuel prices in Petrograd rose enormously. Long lines of people waited on the streets for basic rations. Increasingly, the people turned their ire toward the Tsar, who they held responsible for their hardships. They believed he acted either out of stupidity or possibly even pro-German treason. On March 8th, International Women's Day, about 90,000 men and women in Petrograd rallied to protest food shortages. Although peaceful at first, the protests grew rapidly and became ever more grim. In just 2 days, they had turned into a general strike. Factory production came to a standstill, and police stations were raided. Although Cossack regiments were present to restore order, the soldiers did nothing. That evening, the Tsar, who was at the war front at the time, decided to act. Nicholas ordered the commander-in-chief of the Petrograd military district to end the disturbances. Many of the soldiers refused to fire on the protesters. These men openly sympathized with the demonstrators and mutinied. With the capital in open revolt, liberal politicians in the Duma convinced high-ranking officers that the only way for stability to return was for Nicholas to step down as emperor. Pressured by the army, Nicholas abdicated on behalf of himself and his son. He passed the throne to his brother, Mikhail, but the reluctant Grand Duke declined power. Russia officially became a republic a few months later. After the February Revolution, two centers of power emerged. The political moderates in the Duma formed a provisional government, which acted as the official national government. Representatives of Petrograd's worker class set up a local Soviet, a council that at first mostly served to coordinate the strikes, but soon came to play a much bigger role. As its first act, the Petrograd Soviet declared political authority over the armed forces, encouraged soldiers to set up their own committees, and decreed that the orders of the provisional government were only to be carried out if they did not conflict with those of the Soviet. The influence of the Soviet quickly expanded beyond Petrograd, as it became the most vocal voice for workers, sailors, and soldiers nationwide. Although the provisional government held formal power, the Petrograd Soviet held more hands-on authority. It controlled the troops, the railroads, the post, and the telegraph. Although the Soviet acted as representatives of the increasingly radical workers and soldiers, decisions were mostly made by moderate socialists, like Mensheviks and social revolutionaries, who wanted to work together with the Russian bourgeoisie. The more radical Bolshevik faction and its leader, Vladimir Lenin, harshly opposed these moderate policies. After his return from exile in April, he openly called for the immediate overthrow of the bourgeois-dominated provisional government and insisted that all power should go to the Soviets. The moderates in neither the Petrograd Soviet nor the provisional government truly represented the revolutionary tide that swept through Russia. Peasants started seizing lands and setting up their own peasants' committees. More and more, Russians openly turned against the war effort. The Bolsheviks denounced the war as imperialist and pledged to end Russia's involvement immediately. The provisional government resolutely refused to take Russia out of the war and remained committed to the Entente. To bolster the faltering front line, Minister of Defense and future Prime Minister Alexander Kerensky ordered a massive offensive in Galicia. Initial success was short-lived. Officers complained that the liberal reforms of the Petrograd Soviet were to blame for the general lack of discipline, desertions, and mutinies. To save the war effort and empower his officers to enforce discipline, Kerensky reversed many of the soldiers' privileges, reimposed the death penalty, and promoted General Lavr Kornilov, a vocal opponent of the revolutionary changes, to the position of commander-in-chief. The Kerensky offensive also caused new anti-war protests in Petrograd. On July 16th, demonstrations broke out in the capital, headed by the heavily pro-Bolshevik 1st Machine Guns Regiment, which Kerensky had attempted to transfer to the front. For 2 days, armed Bolsheviks occupied the capital. Lenin and the leaders of the party distanced themselves from the revolt, fearing that the provisional government still had too much support for it to succeed. Without its leaders, the protests became aimless. The ensuing government crackdown decimated the Bolshevik movement. Lenin was accused of being a pro-German agent and was forced to flee to Finland. while thousands of prominent Bolsheviks, notably including Leon Trotsky, were imprisoned. Although both Kornilov and Kerensky shared the need for iron-fisted military discipline to save Russia's faltering war effort, they deeply mistrusted each other. This distrust fueled a self-fulfilling prophecy. Kerensky believed a rumor that Kornilov planned a military coup and dismissed him. As a reaction to his dismissal, the coup became inevitable. Kornilov marched on the capital on September 10th. In response, the Provisional Government and the Petrograd Soviet formed the Committee for Struggle Against Counter-Revolution. While a joint effort on paper, the committee was defined by Leon Trotsky and the Bolsheviks, who set the masses of workers and soldiers in motion. With their effort, Kornilov's coup fell apart. The defense of Petrograd was a major propaganda victory for the Bolsheviks, who were increasingly seen as the defenders of the revolution. The political fallout of the Kornilov affair was immense. Kerensky was now hated by both sides of the political divide. Many conservatives and generals sympathized with Kornilov, while revolutionaries despised him for promoting Kornilov in the first place. The Bolsheviks capitalized on their propaganda victory, and their membership numbers exploded in both Petrograd and the rest of Russia. A worsening economic situation, rumors that the Provisional Government might abandon Petrograd to flee the ever-approaching German army, or move the revolutionary Petrograd garrison to the front, further bolstered Bolshevik support. The Petrograd Soviet even officially adopted a Bolshevik resolution calling for a Soviet government. With the momentum behind them, Lenin was adamant that the time for a Bolshevik insurrection had come. Under his instructions, the Bolsheviks dramatically walked out of the Russian legislature. In his view, the Bolsheviks had to assume power to progress the revolution from a bourgeois revolt to a proletarian one. He returned from Finland, and the Central Committee soon after adopted a motion that declared an armed uprising is inevitable. The Bolshevik insurrection was no secret. Opponents of the revolt leaked details in newspapers. Kerensky, well aware of the plot, acted to arrest the leaders of Bolshevik militias and close down the Bolshevik press. Kerensky's reaction hastened the Bolshevik insurrection. Throughout November 6th, Bolshevik Red Guards battled with Kerensky-aligned troops for control of Petrograd's bridges. By that evening, the Bolsheviks were well in control of the city's infrastructure and communications. That night, Red Guards systematically occupied government buildings and facilities in Petrograd. Kerensky left Petrograd with the support of the American embassy, looking for loyal troops to restore order in the capital. The provisional government, held up in the Winter Palace, fell the next night. Although the Bolshevik uprising in Petrograd was swift and fairly peaceful, follow-up uprisings showed a better indication of the violence to come. In the aftermath of the October Revolution, Soviets throughout the country took control, some more successful than others. Bolshevik forces in Moscow clashed fiercely with those of the Republic, and a fierce battle for the Kremlin raged for a week. As Lenin proclaimed the creation of the Russian Soviet Republic, forces on all sides of the political spectrum conspired to take his regime down. A diverse coalition of Mensheviks, social revolutionaries, liberals, monarchists, and ultranationalists would unite under the White Movement. The Central Powers, separatists, and Allied interventions would all challenge the world's first socialist state in what would become one of the 20th century's deadliest civil wars. Deep in the snowy Siberian wastes, two Czechoslovak soldiers guard a long armored train, weathering the freezing -40 degrees temperature. Just a year ago, they fought with the Tsar's armies. Now, they're embroiled in a political maelstrom following the October Revolution. Destined for Vladivostok via the Trans-Siberian Railroad, the mistrustful Bolshevik government orders the disarmament and arrest of these legionnaires. As they take up arms, these trapped Czechoslovaks would come to play a pivotal part in the chaos and cruelty of the Russian Civil War. Immediately after taking over Petrograd, the scale of opposition to Bolshevik rule became clear. Many non-Bolshevik socialists denounced Lenin's coup as a criminal venture and walked out of the Soviet legislature. Radical and uncompromising laws, including abolishing the private ownership of land, nationalizing banks, and abolishing the prestigious aristocratic ranks of civil servants, led to public anger. When Leon Trotsky, the new Minister of Foreign Affairs, introduced himself to his employees, he was met with ironic laughter, after which 600 employees promptly left the ministry. General strikes paralyzed the government as it struggled to find even a faint semblance of legitimacy. Finland, Ukraine, and the Caucasus all drifted away from Russian control, while disgruntled Tsarist officers and independent Cossack hosts rose up in southern Russia. In the immediate aftermath of the October Revolution, Prime Minister Kerensky rallied 700 Cossacks under the command of General Pyotr Krasanov to assault Petrograd. As Krasanov marched, anti-Bolshevik forces emerged within the city as well, thanks to assistance from nearby pro-Bolshevik sailors in Kronstadt and over 6,000 Red Guards. Kerensky's effort faltered. Although the former prime minister would never pose a significant threat again, his attempt marked the first in a long list of anti-Bolshevik attacks. Lenin's increasing authoritarianism turned more and more people against him. In the last week of 1917, his government started robbing citizens to acquire funds. To help consolidate Bolshevik control, the Soviets formed a secret police known as the Cheka, who quickly became a tool of repression and fear against all who opposed Bolshevik policies. In January the next year, Lenin forcefully dissolved the democratically elected Constituent Assembly in favor of a Bolshevik-dominated Third All-Russian Congress of Soviets. More and more, the Bolsheviks sought to impose a new and uncompromising vision on Russia. That vision led to more enemies after signing the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany in March of 1918. Lenin had promised to bring peace to the war-weary Russian nation and issued a decree of peace after coming to power. Peace, however, would neither come cheap nor easy. The Entente nations warned that if Russia sought a separate peace, it would entail the gravest of consequences. Moreover, while Lenin insisted peace was needed to give the revolution breathing space to grow, fellow leftists both inside and outside the Bolshevik Party believed making peace with Germany would strangle the revolution. In the end, Trotsky spearheaded a policy of no war, no peace, arguing that if the Russian army ceased fighting, Germany would be forced to halt its invasion, as it could not justify prolonging the war to its own people. Instead, the Germans pushed 150 miles, or 241 kilometers, into Russia within just 5 days during Operation Faustschlag. After 11 days, the Germans provided new, harsher terms. Lenin forced his reluctant cabinet to sign. The treaty would cost him land, industry, and the last of his leftist allies outside of the Bolshevik faction, who denounced him as a traitor and German spy. As 1918 progressed, the Bolshevik situation became increasingly dire. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk had signed away a quarter of Russia's territory, nearly 40% of its population, and 75% of its iron and steel production. Furthermore, the treaty subjected Russia to enormous German influence. German nationals were granted extraterritorial status inside Russia, and the Red Army was directly subsidized by the German embassy. While Germany kept Lenin's regime on life support, they simultaneously extorted the government for ever more concessions. In August, the Bolsheviks had to sign yet another agreement, which made Lenin pay billions in reparations, recognize German influence over Georgia, and cede 25% of Baku's oil production. Other nations also sought influence across Russia. The Ottoman Empire captured vast lands in the Caucasus, and Romania seized Moldova. A day after Brest-Litovsk, 170 British troops landed in the port of Murmansk to protect Allied weapon stockpiles from the Germans. France, the United States, Japan, and China also sent troops into Russia, driven by fears for their own citizens' safety, the hope of rekindling Russia's fight against Germany, and in some cases, sheer imperial ambition. As Russia became little more than a playground for outside powers, the widespread uprisings against the Bolsheviks crystallized into a full-scale civil war. In southern Russia, conservative officers formed the Volunteer Army. After successfully retreating from a larger Bolshevik force during the harrowing Ice March, this army remained a thorn in Lenin's side for years. The newly formed Red Army was poorly equipped and poorly organized, so much so that when the experienced Czechoslovak Legion revolted in May, the Reds lost near total control of Siberia. Here, a series of anti-Bolshevik provisional governments emerged. The most notable of these was Kamuch. They renounced the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk and invited the Entente nations to intervene in the Civil War. These Russians who rose to oppose the Bolsheviks collectively became the White Movement. Thanks to the efforts of the Czechoslovaks and considerable international support, the White Army won a series of sweeping victories on the Siberian outskirts and Volga Basin. They conquered Kazan, where much of the imperial gold reserve was stored, and Yekaterinberg, where the interned Romanov family were viciously murdered in the ominous House of Special Purpose. On the night of July 16th to the 17th, the former Tsar and his family were suddenly woken up. The White Army was approaching Yekaterinburg, and the Bolsheviks deeply feared that the family could be captured and possibly even liberated. Likely under orders of the local Soviet, the entire family were repeatedly shot and bayoneted. After that, they were horribly mutilated, mangled, and disfigured beyond recognition. The violence and brutality of the Civil War consumed all of Russia, and not even Lenin could escape it. While visiting a local factory in Moscow, he was shot 3 times, with the wounds nearly killing him. The person arrested was Fanny Kaplan, a former anarchist who expressed her sympathy for the anti-Bolshevik Kamuch. Although Lenin survived his assassination attempt, another hit was carried out at the same time on the prominent Bolshevik Moisey Uritsky, who wasn't so lucky. The assassination attempts ramped up Bolshevik terror. Central authorities blamed the crimes on socialist revolutionaries of the right, hirelings of the British and French, and made merciless mass terror against the enemies of the revolution the order of the day. Tribunals were set up in Moscow's prisons. The government legalized summary executions, and concentration camps popped up near all the fronts. In the first 2 months alone, nearly 15,000 Russian citizens lost their lives due to the Red Terror. The White Armies, and separatists too, used terror tactics. In areas controlled by White Armies, suspected Bolsheviks were killed without question. Anti-communists regularly targeted Jews, who many leaders saw as Bolshevik plotters. Up to 250,000 Jews were viciously murdered in 2,000 pogroms. White and Red armies committed similar atrocities, like burning down villages, requisitioning property, persecuting families, and executions. As one historian puts it, the civil wars were primitive wars, fought with modern weapons. To weather the onslaught of insurgents and intervening powers, Lenin and his government resorted to a strategy known as war communism. The economic collapse of Russia in 1918 was unprecedented. virtually wiping an entire continent off the economic map. The Bolsheviks took desperate, extreme measures to continue fighting. All industries were nationalized, strikes were outlawed, non-working classes were subjected to forced labor, and food was requisitioned to prevent cities from starving while also keeping the Red Army fed. War communism was in large parts influenced by practical necessity. It was also born out of Lenin's class warfare theories. Bolsheviks set up rural poor committees to extract surplus from wealthy peasants, so-called kulaks, and forced urban populations to work on Saturdays and Sundays, in parts as a mean to strike a blow against organized religion. Starting in October 1918, the Soviet government drafted hundreds of thousands of peasants to fight in the Red Army, with the aim to grow it to 3 million men within half a year. Trotsky, now Commissar for War, managed to turn the Red Army into an effective fighting force by severely punishing desertion and retreat and enlisting experienced Tsarist officers. Through military reform, war communism, extensive propaganda, and terror tactics, Lenin's regime was willing to do whatever was necessary to achieve its goals. Despite these reforms, the Soviet situation continued to look bleak. After the execution of the Tsar, the Czechoslovak legions seized even more land, and Bolshevik control over Siberia diminished further. The Allies expanded their hold over northern Russia and the Far East, where they had landed in Vladivostok. By September, many anti-Bolshevik forces met in Ufa, where they formed the Provisional All-Russian Government. While initially democratic, this government would only last 2 months before it succumbed to a coup by Admiral Alexander Kolchak. After assuming the title of Supreme Ruler, Kolchak's rule defined the White Movement as an authoritarian, nationalist, and militarist force that terrorized revolutionaries, socialists, Jews, and dissidents. Just a week before Kolchak's coup, the balance of power in Russia's vicious civil war shifted radically once more. On November 11th, the German Empire agreed to an armistice with the Entente. As one of the armistice's consequences, Germany evacuated the areas that used to belong to the Russian Empire. 2 days later, the Bolsheviks nullified the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. From Tallinn to Sevastopol, and from Batum to Baku, central authority collapsed, and nationalists, whites, reds, and allied intervention forces prepared for the uncertain future of Russia. After his ascension to supreme leader of the White Movement, Alexander Kolchak planned an offensive toward the Volga River. The Whites controlled considerably more territory and had the support of well-disciplined troops along with the international community. But the Reds were growing in strength. With access to most of Russia's industry, a far larger population, and the bulk of the railway network, Lenin and his Bolsheviks were in a much better position to win the war long-term. Unlike the Reds, the White armies were fragmented. Kolchak's army in the east and Anton Denikin's army in the south could not coordinate effectively. Instead, communications had to be routed via Vladivostok and Paris. The Whites were also deeply unpopular. The continued Allied military presence in Russia after the Great War was seen by many as a foreign invasion, and the White armies were discredited as foreign puppets. Many peasants, whose support was crucial for the war effort, also deeply resented the old feudal order that the Whites represented. Kolchak's spring offensive in 1919 had a promising start. Within 2 months, the White armies pushed 340 miles, or 547 kilometers west, and came close to the Volga. The Whites celebrated, while a panicked Trotsky ordered all reinforcements to the east. Their optimism would prove premature, however. Their advance turned into a slog as the Rasputitsa trapped the advancing armies in a sea of mud, giving the Reds time to reorganize. The Red Army struck back at Kolchak's weak southern flank. Between May and October, they forced Kolchak's forces back to their capital in Omsk. As they retreated, the White armies began melting away as conscripts deserted en masse. But while Kolchak's offensive was quelled, the Bolshevik heartland faced new threats. Over the summer and fall, the Whites would be at the gates of both Petrograd and Moscow. In the south, Denikin's forces in southern Russia had become a major threat. Although it numbered just 100,000 soldiers, it consisted of some of the most elite infantry and cavalry in the conflict. Cavalry was crucial for the maneuver-heavy warfare of the Russian Civil War. Yet Trotsky and the Reds denounced mounted warfare as ultra-reactionary. In the summer of 1919, the Whites won a series of victories in the south, notably by deploying British tanks to breach Bolshevik defenses. Tsaritsyn fell to the decorated cavalry officer Pyotr Wrangel. On July 3rd, Denikin issued the secret Moscow Directive. All across southern Russia, the White Army moved north to converge on Moscow and seize the nearby military factories. The advance progressed steadily. Red morale seemed to collapse as several units deserted to the White movement. When 8,000 Cossacks captured Voronezh and Tempov, panic swept across the streets of Moscow. The Red capital was on the horizon, but the Whites had to cope with an overstretched front and precarious supply and communication lines, which were constantly under threat by partisans and anarchists. Simultaneously, another White army massed at the gates of Petrograd. The Northwestern Army, under Nikolai Yudenich, had fought alongside Estonian fighters in their war for independence against the Soviets. After the Reds were cleared from the country, this army crossed into Russia from the west, with support from Estonia and the British Royal Navy. It advanced within 15 miles or 24 kilometers of Petrograd in a month. With the Whites so close, the chairman of the local Soviet suffered a nervous collapse, leaving the city's defense to Trotsky. Although the Whites seemed poised to topple Bolshevik rule, the reality of their situation differed. Denikin, Kolchak, and Yudenich shared similar problems. Each of their assaults ran out of steam while their rears disintegrated, either due to revolts or urgent military situations elsewhere. Additionally, the White armies and Entente allies generally failed to synchronize their attacks, allowing the Bolsheviks to focus on one army at a time. To add a final nail to the coffin, Trotsky had finally changed his mind on cavalry and started employing it to great effect. By the second half of 1919, the Reds advanced into Siberia, where they seized Omsk. Exiled from their fallen capital, the White Army crumbled to pieces on their grueling retreat east in the Great Siberian Ice March. Meanwhile, left-wing revolutionaries in Irkutsk were able to strike a deal with the Czechoslovak Legion. In exchange for Kolchak and the White movement's gold reserves, the tired and homesick legionnaires would be given free transit out of Russia. The legionnaires agreed, leading to a revolt in the city and Kolchak's capture. The new government in Irkutsk surrendered its authority to the Bolsheviks, and Kolchak was executed in February 1920. The final survivors escaped on a hellish journey across Lake Baikal, hoping to find Japanese protection there. As for Yudenich and Denikin, their end was anticlimactic. Trotsky rallied the defenders of Petrograd and quickly brought in reinforcements, beating Yudenich back to Estonia. Soon after, Estonia and Soviet Russia made peace, and Yudenich's army ceased to exist. Denikin's offensive was decisively defeated after a Red cavalry counterattack forced the Whites into a long retreat to Crimea. As the White armies swarmed into the hearts of Ukraine and Russia, the anarchists became a major force in their collapse. Under the leadership of Nestor Makhno, his anarchist Black Army fought against both the Whites and the Reds. Throughout the Civil War, Makhno carved out a territory where independent Soviets ruled, free from central control. This territory became known as the Makhnovshchina. Although the anarchists had supported the Bolsheviks during their takeover in 1917, they distanced themselves from Lenin and his increasingly authoritarian policies. Makhno himself was released from prison only months before that and returned to his home city of Holyopol, where he set up the Revolutionary Insurgent Army of Ukraine to combat white forces, Ukrainian nationalists, and the Central Powers. Throughout 1918 and 1919, he sided mostly with the Red Army, although he despised the Bolshevik political control over it. During this time, the Makhnovshchina operated near independently. It redistributed land to peasants, established schools and hospitals, and granted freedom of speech, press, and association to the population. Nonetheless, the territory was no paradise. Like so many other factions, Makhno requisitioned peasant produce and conscripted young men. And like so many factions, he brutally enforced revolutionary dogma. The fragile alliance between the Bolsheviks and Makhnovists broke down whenever there was no acute threat from mutually hated factions. After the White Movement was fully defeated, the Bolsheviks unleashed Red Terror on the Makhnovshchina and pursued Makhno's forces throughout Ukraine for half a year, until he fled to Romania in 1921. By 1920, the tide of the Russian Civil War had turned decisively in the Bolsheviks' favor. Only 30,000 men remained under the command of Pyotr Wrangel, who fortified the resourceless yet highly defensible Crimean Peninsula. In contrast to other white leaders, Wrangel had a just and honorable reputation. He did not tolerate lawlessness or looting, and instead advocated stability, democracy, and federalism for national minorities. He consented to agrarian reform and adopted worker-friendly legislation. Through moderate reform, the Black Baron hoped to broaden his support within Russia. However, reforms came far too late. The White Movement had long lost its momentum and its international support. Throughout 1919 and 1920, almost all Allied interventions withdrew, mainly due to a lack of morale and domestic opposition against continued intervention. Especially after the defeats of Denikin and Yudenich, many foreign leaders recognized the military reality that the Reds had won. As foreign aid collapsed, the white forces and their morale collapsed with them. The sole exception to this was the Japanese, who used a massacre against Russian and Japanese citizens in Nikolaevsk to launch a new all-out offensive in the spring of 1920. The Japanese attack coincided with a Polish attack in the west. After the German collapse, forces of the expansionist Second Polish Republic clashed repeatedly with other independence movements and the Bolsheviks. In May of 1920, those clashes flared up into an all-out Soviet-Polish war. The Poles, alongside Ukrainian allies, quickly gained ground at the start of the war and seized Kiev just a month later. The Soviet-Polish War coincided with a white breakout out of Crimea. The Red Armies, distracted by the ongoing war with Poland, were ill-prepared for a white counteroffensive. In mere weeks, Wrangel secured the highly fertile and resource-rich region of northern Taurida, but his offensive ran out of initiative quickly. Future attempts by Wrangel's White Army to seize more land in the Kuban region and other parts of Ukraine failed. On the Polish front, meanwhile, a dramatic reversal had taken place. Whereas the Poles had been in Kiev in June, by August, they were pushed back to the gates of Warsaw. Despite the seemingly insurmountable odds for Poland, a careless and botched Soviet assault had dramatic consequences. The Polish victory cost the Red Army 75 to 90% of its combat strength in casualties. As Poland started to push the Reds back, Wrangel hoped the Poles might relieve his position, but that was not to be. Fighting between Poland and Russia ceased in October, leaving Wrangel to face the Red Army alone. Outnumbering the Whites nearly 4-1, Wrangel's army was swiftly pushed back into Crimea. The Black Baron's domain was kept secure from tailing Bolsheviks thanks to a geographic choke point in the north, which the Reds could not easily breach. However, a freak weather event revealed another gateway into the peninsula, which the Reds exploited. In 10 vicious days, the last of the Whites' forces were defeated. Wrangel evacuated the peninsula, taking some 150,000 soldiers and civilians, and headed for the Ottoman capital of Constantinople. Those who failed to escape suffered the full wrath of the Red Terror. Anywhere between 12,000 and 120,000 people were executed. The Civil War was as good as over, but it would not be the end of the carnage. Green peasant armies continued to rise in response to the brutal Bolshevik requisition policies and looming famines, many of whom were brutally suppressed through the large-scale use of chemical weapons. In Kronstadt, sailors rose against inadequate food supply, restrictive political freedoms, and harsh labor regulations. Like so many others, the revolt was crushed brutally and without remorse. Japan continued to occupy much of the Far East until 1922 and North Sakhalin until 1925. After years of war, destruction, and famine, Lenin proclaimed the Soviet Union on December 30th, 1922, at the human cost of as many as 10 million people. Thanks again to Supremacy 1914 for sponsoring this video. Support our channel and click the link in the description or scan the QR code to receive 31 days of premium account for new players, plus 50 shards to unlock the Lucien LaRoche hero at level 1 status, a package worth $15 US, available only for the next 30 days.